The morning sun barely pierced the gray haze of the city, casting a muted glow over the cracked sidewalks of East Side, a neighborhood where dreams often came to die. Marcus Jackson moved through the streets with a quiet determination, his worn sneakers slapping against the pavement, his breath visible in the chilly dawn air. At 32, Marcus carried himself with the kind of strength forged from years of pushing against a world that seemed determined to push back harder. His dark skin gleamed under the faint sunlight, and his eyes, sharp and guarded, scanned the familiar storefronts, a bodega with flickering neon, a laundromat buzzing with early risers, and the looming glass tower of Pinnacle Solutions, where he worked as a junior IT specialist. Marcus had grown up in East Side, in a small apartment filled with the laughter of his mother and the wisdom of his grandmother, both of whom taught him to hold his head high despite the whispers and stares that often followed him. He was no stranger to prejudice, to the subtle and not so subtle ways the world reminded him of his place. But Pinnacle was supposed to be different. It was a tech firm, a place of progress and innovation, where skills were meant to matter more than skin. Marcus had believed that, or at least he wanted to, when he landed the job 2 years ago after clawing his way through night classes and certifications while working odd jobs to pay the bills. Inside the sleek, air-conditioned lobby of Pinnacle, Marcus swiped his ID badge and stepped into the elevator, ignoring the sideways glance from a suited man who clutched his briefcase a little tighter. The office on the 15th floor was a hive of activity. Cubicles buzzing with the hum of computers, the clatter of keyboards, and the low murmur of corporate ambition. Marcus's desk was tucked in a corner, near a window that offered a view of the city's jagged skyline. He liked it there, not because of the view, but because it was out of the way, a small pocket of peace in a workplace that often felt like a battlefield. His boss, Richard Caldwell, was the kind of man who wore his privilege like a tailored suit. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a perpetual smirk and a voice that carried the weight of unearned authority, Richard ran the IT department with an iron grip. To the outside world, he was charming, a poster boy for corporate success, with his polished LinkedIn profile and a knack for delivering presentations that left clients dazzled. But behind closed doors, Richard's charm curdled into something colder. Marcus had felt it from the start, the way Richard's eyes lingered on him a little too long, not with curiosity, but with something closer to disdain. It was in the way Richard dismissed Marcus's ideas in meetings, cutting him off mid-sentence with a wave of his hand, or how he'd forget to include Marcus in team emails, leaving him scrambling to catch up. Marcus wasn't the only one who noticed. His coworker, Aisha, a brilliant coder with a sharp wit, had whispered to him once about Richard's type, the kind of boss who smiled at diversity initiatives but bristled when they actually changed the room. Still, Marcus kept his head down. He needed this job. His mother's medical bills were piling up, and his younger sister, Kayla, was starting college soon. Every paycheck was a lifeline. Every overtime hour a sacrifice he made without complaint. He poured himself into his work, troubleshooting systems, debugging code, and staying late to ensure the company's servers ran smoothly. His performance reviews were stellar, his metrics impeccable. Yet Richard always found something to nitpick. A missed comma in a report, a tone that was too informal in an email. The tension had been building for months, like a storm gathering on the horizon. Marcus sensed it in the way Richard's criticisms grew sharper, more personal. It wasn't just about the work anymore. It was the way Richard would linger near Marcus's desk, making offhand comments about cultural fit, or joking about how Marcus must be so good at basketball, despite Marcus never mentioning sports. The remarks stung, not because they were clever, but because they were relentless, a slow drip of venom that eroded Marcus's confidence. He began to second-guess himself, to wonder if he really belonged in this glass tower, if his presence was an intrusion rather than a contribution. One morning, the storm broke. Marcus arrived at his desk to find an email from Richard, curt and cold, summoning him to the corner office. His stomach twisted as he walked across the open, plan office, past rows of cubicles where heads turned and whispers followed. Richard's office was a shrine to his ego. Awards lined the walls, a mahogany desk gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and a framed photo of him shaking hands with the CEO sat prominently displayed. Marcus stood in the doorway, his hands clasped behind his back, bracing himself. Richard didn't look up from his computer at first, letting Marcus stand there in silence. the power dynamic as clear as the polished glass separating them from the rest of the office. When he finally spoke, his voice was clipped, his words rehearsed. The company was restructuring, he said. Budget cuts. Tough decisions. Marcus's position was being eliminated, effective immediately. No severance, no explanation beyond vague corporate jargon. Marcus felt the floor tilt beneath him, the air growing thick with the weight of what wasn't said. He wanted to ask why. Why him when his work was flawless, when he'd stayed late, covered shifts, fixed crises no one else could. But Richard's eyes, cold and unyielding, told him the question was pointless. As Marcus packed his belongings into a small cardboard box, a photo of his mother, a mug Kayla had painted for him as a kid, humiliation burned in his chest. Colleagues avoided his gaze, their silence louder than any words. Aisha slipped him a note, her handwriting shaky. This isn't right. I'm so sorry. But sorry didn't change the fact that Marcus was walking out of Pinnacle with nothing but a box and a bruised sense of self. The elevator ride down felt like a descent into a void, each floor a reminder of the dreams he'd pinned on this job. Outside, the city air hit him like a slap, and he stood on the sidewalk, staring at the tower that had chewed him up and spit him out. He didn't know it yet, but this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something bigger, something that would unravel Richard's carefully constructed world in ways neither of them could imagine. As Marcus walked away, the weight of his firing settled into his bones, but so did a flicker of resolve. He wasn't done fighting. Not yet. Somewhere in the shadows of his anger and pain, karma was already stirring, waiting for its moment to strike. The days following Marcus Jackson's firing blurred into a haze of disbelief and quiet rage. The East Side apartment he shared with his mother and sister felt smaller now, its walls closing in as he sat at the kitchen table, staring at a laptop screen filled with job applications. The hum of the refrigerator and the distant wail of sirens outside were the only sounds breaking the silence. Marcus's mother, Evelyn, moved slowly around the kitchen, her hands trembling slightly from the arthritis that had worsened since her hospital stay last spring. She didn't ask about the firing, not directly, but her eyes carried a weight of worry that made Marcus's chest ache. He hadn't told her the full story, how Richard Caldwell's decision felt like a knife twisted with intent, how the word restructuring rang hollow against the backdrop of his flawless record. He couldn't bear to see her hope dim further. Marcus's sister, Kayla, was another matter. At 18, she was a firecracker, her energy a stark contrast to the heaviness that had settled over their home. She was home from her first semester at community college, her textbooks scattered across the living room floor, her dreams of becoming a nurse pinned to every late-night study session. Kayla sensed something was wrong the moment she saw Marcus's face, but he brushed off her questions with a forced smile, promising he'd find another job soon. The truth was, he wasn't sure where to start. The tech industry in the city was tight-knit, and Richard's influence cast a long shadow. Marcus had heard stories of blacklisted employees, their reputations tarnished by a single powerful enemy. The thought gnawed at him, keeping him awake at night as he replayed every moment at Pinnacle, searching for the mistake he must have made. The reality of his situation sank in deeper with each rejection email. We've decided to move forward with another candidate. They read, or worse, no response at all. Marcus spent hours tweaking his resume, highlighting his certifications, his projects. The late nights he'd spent saving Pinnacle's servers from crashes that could have cost the company thousands. But the silence from recruiters was deafening. He began to wonder if Richard had spread whispers about him, subtle poison that closed doors before Marcus could even knock. The idea wasn't far-fetched. Richard had a reputation for holding grudges, for ensuring those he deemed unfit didn't rise again. Marcus had seen it happen to others. A quiet word here, a phone call there, and suddenly a colleague was untouchable, their career in ruins. Yet Marcus wasn't one to wallow. He'd grown up in a neighborhood where survival meant resilience, where every setback was a test of how hard you could fight back. He started reaching out to old contacts, people he'd met in night classes or through freelance gigs. One of them, Jamal, a coder who ran a small tech co-op, invited Marcus to a meetup for independent developers. It was a lifeline, a chance to network outside the corporate machine that had chewed him up. The meetup was held in a cramped community center, the air thick with the smell of coffee and ambition. Marcus felt a spark of hope as he shook hands, shared ideas, and listened to stories of others who'd been pushed out of mainstream tech but found ways to thrive. Jamal, with his quick laugh and sharp mind, pulled Marcus aside and offered him a small freelance project, nothing big but enough to keep the lights on. It was a start. Meanwhile, back at Pinnacle, Richard Caldwell basked in the glow of his unchallenged authority. The IT department ran smoothly, or so it seemed, with Marcus's absence barely acknowledged. Richard had already hired a replacement, a young man named Ethan who shared his alma mater and his taste for expensive bourbon. Ethan was eager, malleable, the kind of employee Richard could mold without resistance. To Richard, Marcus's firing was a minor blip, a necessary pruning to maintain the culture. He prided himself on curating. He didn't lose sleep over it. In fact, he felt a quiet satisfaction, a sense that he'd put things right, restored the order he believed Pinnacle deserved. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming. Aisha, Marcus's former co-worker, hadn't let the injustice slide. She'd noticed the pattern, how Richard's restructuring always seemed to target those who didn't fit his narrow vision of success. She began quietly documenting things. Emails where Richard dismissed Marcus's contributions, meeting notes where his ideas were ignored. Performance reviews that contradicted the glowing metrics Marcus had earned. Aisha wasn't sure what she'd do with the information, but she felt a fire growing inside her, a need to expose the truth. She wasn't alone. Other employees, those who'd seen Marcus's dedication, whispered in break rooms and over coffee, their discontent simmering like a pot ready to boil over. Marcus, unaware of the ripples his departure had caused, threw himself into the freelance project. It was grueling work, debugging code for a small startup with a shoestring budget, but it gave him purpose. He worked late into the night, his laptop glowing in the dim apartment, his mother's soft snores a reminder of why he couldn't give up. Yet the weight of his firing lingered, a bruise that throbbed with every rejection, every bill that piled up. He began to hear rumors, whispers from old colleagues that Richard was facing pressure. A major client project, one Marcus had spearheaded, was faltering without his expertise. Deadlines were slipping and Ethan, for all his eagerness, couldn't fill the gap Marcus had left. One evening, as Marcus walked home from the community center, his phone buzzed with a message from Aisha. It was cryptic, just a single line. "Things are heating up here. Stay ready." His pulse quickened. He didn't know what she meant, but the words carried a promise, a hint that the tide might be turning. As he stepped into the apartment, Kayla looked up from her textbooks, her eyes bright with curiosity. Marcus didn't tell her about the message, but for the first time in weeks, he felt a flicker of something dangerous hope. Whatever was coming, he sensed it would change everything. The wheels of karma were turning, slow but relentless, and Richard Caldwell's world was about to face a reckoning Marcus couldn't yet see. The air in Eastside carried a restless energy as autumn deepened, the trees shedding their leaves like secrets too heavy to hold. Marcus Jackson moved through the neighborhood with a renewed sense of purpose, his steps lighter than they'd been since his firing from Pinnacle Solutions. The freelance project with Jamal's co-op had grown from a small gig into a steady stream of work, enough to cover rent and ease the strain on his mother's weary shoulders. Evelyn's health was fragile, her arthritis flaring with the changing seasons, but Marcus saw a spark of relief in her eyes when he paid the latest medical bill without hesitation. Kayla, too, seemed to sense the shift, her laughter filling the apartment more often as she teased Marcus about his late, night-coding marathons. Yet, beneath the surface, Marcus carried the weight of his past, the sting of Richard Caldwell's betrayal, a shadow that lingered in his quieter moments. The freelance work wasn't just about money. It was a lifeline to a world Marcus had feared he'd lost. The community center meetups had introduced him to a network of developers, designers, and dreamers, people who, like him, had been pushed to the margins but refused to stay there. They shared stories of corporate gatekeepers, of bosses like Richard who wielded power with a smile and a knife. Marcus found himself speaking up more, sharing his expertise, and earning respect in a space where his skin didn't mark him as an outsider. Jamal, with his infectious optimism, had big plans for the co-op, talking about launching their own app, something to rival the corporate giants. Marcus listened, his mind racing with ideas, but a part of him remained tethered to Pinnacle, not out of loyalty, but out of a burning need for justice. Back at Pinnacle, the polished facade of Richard Caldwell's kingdom was beginning to crack. The major client project Marcus had once led, A complex server migration for a high-profile financial firm was unraveling. Deadlines slipped like sand through fingers, and Ethan, Richard's hand-picked replacement, was drowning in the complexity Marcus had navigated with ease. Richard's temper flared in meetings, his usual charm replaced by sharp-edged frustration. He barked orders, micromanaged every detail, and deflected blame onto his team. But the client wasn't fooled. They sent emails laced with polite but pointed dissatisfaction, their trust in Pinnacle eroding with every missed milestone. Whispers spread through the office, quiet at first, then bolder. Richard had made a mistake letting Marcus go, and the consequences were piling up. Aisha, ever observant, watched the chaos unfold from her cubicle. She'd always been meticulous, her code clean and her instincts sharp. But now she turned her attention to something more dangerous, exposing Richard's bias. The notes she'd been compiling since Marcus's firing grew into a dossier. Emails, performance reviews, meeting minutes, all painting a picture of a man who targeted those who didn't fit his vision of Pinnacle's culture. Aisha wasn't alone in her discontent. Other employees, particularly those who'd felt Richard's subtle slights over the years, began to share their own stories. There was Javier, a junior developer who'd been passed over for promotions despite his talent, and Priya, a project manager whose suggestions Richard dismissed with a smirk. The whispers grew into a quiet alliance, a shared resolve to hold Richard accountable. Marcus, unaware of the brewing storm at Pinnacle, threw himself into the Co-op's new Project T, an app designed to connect freelancers with small businesses, cutting out the corporate middlemen who often exploited them. The work was exhilarating, a chance to build something meaningful, but it was also grueling. Late nights blurred into early mornings, his eyes burning from hours of staring at code. Yet every line he wrote felt like a rebellion, a way to reclaim the dignity Richard had tried to strip away. Jamal pushed him to take on a leadership role, recognizing Marcus's knack for solving problems others couldn't. For the first time since his firing, Marcus felt like he was building a future, not just surviving. But the past wasn't done with him. One evening, as he walked home under the glow of streetlights, his phone buzzed with another message from Aisha. Clients pulling out. Richard's panicking. You need to know what's coming. Marcus's heart thudded in his chest. He didn't know the details, but he could feel the ground shifting. The client project, the one he'd poured his soul into, was collapsing, and Richard's carefully constructed world was teetering on the edge. Marcus didn't respond to the message, but he saved it, a small piece of evidence that something bigger was at play. At Pinnacle, the pressure was suffocating. The client had scheduled an emergency meeting, and Richard was scrambling to salvage his reputation. He spent late nights in his office, his tie loosened, his smirk replaced by a grimace as he pored over reports he barely understood. Ethan, overwhelmed and out of his depth, was no help. Richard's thoughts drifted, unbidden, to Marcus, his quiet competence, his ability to untangle the messiest systems. For a fleeting moment, Richard wondered if he'd made a mistake, but he pushed the thought away. Admitting fault wasn't in his nature. Instead, he doubled down, blaming his team, the client, anyone but himself. Aisha, meanwhile, was making moves. She'd connected with a friend in HR, someone who'd grown tired of Pinnacle's glossy promises and empty diversity initiatives. Together, they began to strategize, looking for ways to bring Richard's actions to light without risking their own careers. It was a dangerous game, one that required precision and courage. Aisha knew the stakes, her job, her reputation, the fragile hope of change. But she also knew Marcus's story wasn't unique. It was a thread in a larger tapestry of injustice, and pulling it might unravel everything. As Marcus lay in bed that night, the city's hum a familiar lullaby, he couldn't shake Aisha's message. What was coming? Was it redemption, revenge, or something else entirely? He didn't know, but he felt the stirrings of a reckoning, a force gathering strength in the shadows. Richard's world was crumbling, and Marcus, without realizing it, was at the center of the storm. The next move wasn't his to make, but it was coming, and when it did, it would shake the foundations of everything Pinnacle stood for. The autumn chill had settled deeper into Eastside, the streets alive with the rustle of leaves and the hum of survival. Marcus Jackson moved through this familiar world with a quiet fire in his chest. His days now split between the freelance project with Jamal's Co-op and the lingering ache of his past at Pinnacle Solutions. The Co-op's app was taking shape, its code a tapestry of Marcus's skill and the collective ambition of a team unbound by corporate constraints. Late nights at the community center had become a sanctuary, a place where Marcus's ideas were valued, where his voice carried weight. Yet, beneath his growing confidence, the wound of his firing festered, a reminder of Richard Caldwell's betrayal and the injustice that had pushed him out of a world he'd fought so hard to enter. Marcus's mother, Evelyn, noticed the change in him. Her hands, gnarled by arthritis, moved more steadily now, as if his determination fueled her own. She didn't ask about Pinnacle, but her quiet pride in Marcus's resilience spoke louder than words. Kayla, ever the spark in their small family, filled the apartment with stories of her college classes, her dreams of nursing a beacon that kept Marcus grounded. He worked tirelessly for them, his laptop a constant companion, its glow illuminating the dark corners of their cramped living room. The freelance paychecks were small but steady, enough to keep the bills at bay, though the weight of uncertainty lingered. Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that his story with Pinnacle wasn't over, that the cryptic messages from Aisha hinted at a storm he couldn't yet see. At Pinnacle, that storm was breaking. The client project, once Marcus's domain, had spiraled into chaos. The financial firm, fed up with missed deadlines and shoddy work, issued an ultimatum: fix the issues or lose the contract. Richard Caldwell's polished exterior was cracking, his charm no match for the client's growing fury. In meetings, his voice carried a desperate edge, his usual smirk replaced by beads of sweat on his brow. Ethan, the replacement Richard had staked his reputation on, was floundering, his inexperience a glaring liability. The team, once cowed by Richard's authority, began to push back, their frustration spilling into heated debates and pointed questions. Why had Marcus been let go? Who was responsible for this mess? The whispers that had started in break rooms were now openly voiced, a chorus of discontent that Richard couldn't silence. Aisha was at the heart of this rebellion. Her dossier on Richard had grown, a meticulous record of his biases and mismanagement. She'd uncovered more than she expected. Emails where Richard dismissed diversity initiatives as box ticking, performance reviews that unfairly targeted minority employees, and a pattern of promotions favoring those who mirrored his own background. Aisha shared her findings with her HR contact, a woman named Lena who'd long suspected Richard's true character. Lena was cautious, aware of the risks, but she agreed to escalate the issue to a senior manager who'd recently joined Pinnacle with a mandate to clean house. The evidence was damning, but it needed a spark to ignite real change. Aisha knew that spark was coming, and it was tied to Marcus. Marcus, meanwhile, was making waves of his own. The Co-ops app was gaining traction, with local businesses signing up to test the beta version. Jamal's vision was coming to life, and Marcus was its backbone, debugging code, streamlining features, and mentoring younger developers who looked at him with a mix of awe and gratitude. The work was grueling, but it was his. No one could take it away. No one could dismiss him with a wave of their hand. Yet, even as he built this new world, the old one tugged at him. Aisha's latest message had been brief but urgent. Clients meeting tomorrow. Richard's desperate. Be ready. Marcus didn't know what "be ready" meant, but the words sent a jolt through him, a mix of dread and anticipation. The next morning, Pinnacle's conference room was a battlefield. The client's representatives sat stone-faced, their patience exhausted, as Richard delivered a frantic presentation, his slides riddled with errors Ethan had failed to catch. The room was thick with tension, every mistake a nail in Richard's coffin. Aisha, seated in the back, watched with quiet satisfaction as Richard stumbled over technical details Marcus had once explained with ease. The client's lead, a sharp-eyed woman named Ms. Harper, cut Richard off mid-sentence, her voice cold. She wanted answers, not excuses, and she wanted them now. Richard's face flushed, his hands trembling as he realized the contract and his reputation were slipping away. In a moment of desperation, Richard made a fateful decision. He mentioned Marcus, claiming he'd been consulting with him to fix the issues, a lie so blatant it stunned the room. Aisha's eyes narrowed, her fingers tightening around her pen. She knew Richard was grasping at straws, but she also saw an opportunity. After the meeting, she slipped away to call Marcus, her voice low and urgent. She told him about Richard's lie, about the client's ultimatum, and about the dossier she'd built. She didn't ask Marcus to do anything specific, but her words carried a challenge. This was his chance, his moment to reclaim what was stolen. Marcus sat in his apartment, the phone still warm in his hand, Aisha's words echoing in his mind. He didn't know what Richard was playing at, but the mention of his name felt like a crack in the wall that had kept him out. He thought of his mother's sacrifices, of Kayla's dreams, of the nights he'd spent proving his worth only to be discarded. Anger flared, but so did resolve. He didn't know how, but he knew he had to act. The co-ops app was his future, but Pinnacle was his past, and that past demanded closure. As he opened his laptop, his fingers hovering over the keys, he felt the weight of a decision that could change everything. Richard's lie had opened a door, and Marcus was about to walk through it, ready or not. The dawn broke over Eastside with a quiet ferocity, the sky streaked with hues of orange and gray, mirroring the storm brewing in Marcus Jackson's heart. The weight of Aisha's call lingered, her words a spark that had ignited something fierce within him. Richard Caldwell's lie, claiming Marcus was consulting to save the crumbling client project, felt like a twisted mockery of everything he'd endured at Pinnacle Solutions. Yet, it was also an opening, a crack in the armor of the man who'd cast him out. Marcus sat at the kitchen table, his laptop open, the glow of the screen casting shadows across his face. His mother, Evelyn, was still asleep, her soft breathing a reminder of the stakes. Kayla had left early for a study group, her textbooks a silent testament to the dreams Marcus was fighting to protect. The freelance app with Jamal's co-op was thriving, but this moment wasn't about the future. It was about settling the past. Marcus spent the morning digging through old files, pulling up documentation from the client project he'd led at Pinnacle. He'd kept meticulous records, system diagrams, troubleshooting logs, emails outlining solutions he'd implemented to keep the servers running smoothly. These were the artifacts of his dedication, proof of the expertise Richard had dismissed. As he sifted through the data, his anger sharpened into focus. Richard's lie wasn't just a desperate ploy, it was a theft, an attempt to claim Marcus's work as his own. But Marcus wasn't the same man who'd walked out of Pinnacle with a cardboard box and a bruised spirit. He was stronger now, forged in the fire of rejection and resilience. He drafted an email to Aisha, attaching the files and outlining everything he'd done for the project. If Richard wanted to drag him back into this mess, Marcus would make sure the truth came with him. At Pinnacle, the air was thick with desperation. The client, led by the no-nonsense Ms. Harper, had given Richard one final chance to salvage the contract. The emergency meeting had left the IT department reeling, with Richard's temper fraying at the edges. He snapped at Ethan, whose attempts to fix the server issues were clumsy at best, and ignored the growing unrest among his team. Aisha, Javier, and Priya exchanged glances in the break room, their quiet alliance now a force of its own. Aisha had shared her dossier with Lena in HR, who'd passed it to the senior manager, Mr. Wallace, a man known for his intolerance of incompetence. The evidence was mounting, but it needed a catalyst to bring Richard down. Aisha's call to Marcus had been that catalyst, and his response, those meticulously detailed files, was the ammunition she needed. When Aisha received Marcus's email, her heart raced. The files were a goldmine, a clear record of Marcus's contributions and Richard's negligence. She forwarded them to Lena, who arranged a discreet meeting with Mr. Wallace. The senior manager's face was grim as he reviewed the documents, his fingers tapping a slow rhythm on his desk. He'd heard the rumors about Richard, his favoritism, his subtle but persistent bias, but the evidence before him was undeniable. Marcus's work had been the backbone of the client project, and Richard's decision to fire him wasn't just a mistake, it was a deliberate sabotage rooted in prejudice. Mr. Wallace made a call to Ms. Harper, offering full transparency and a plan to fix the project. He didn't mention Marcus by name, but he promised expertise that would turn things around. Meanwhile, Marcus's life outside Pinnacle was gaining momentum. The co-ops app had caught the attention of a local news outlet, which ran a story about the grassroots tech movement in Eastside. Marcus's name was mentioned, his photo alongside Jamal's, a quiet validation of the work he'd poured his soul into. The article spread online, shared across platforms, and brought a flood of inquiries from small businesses eager to join the app's beta. Jamal was ecstatic, pulling Marcus into late-night planning sessions to scale the project. For the first time in months, Marcus felt like he was building something unbreakable, a legacy that no one could take away. Yet, even as he celebrated these victories, Aisha's updates kept him tethered to Pinnacle, to the fight he hadn't chosen but couldn't walk away from. Back at the corporate tower, Richard was spiraling. The client's demands were relentless, and his attempts to deflect blame were failing. He doubled down on his lie about Marcus, even reaching out to him directly with a curt email requesting assistance on the project. The audacity of it burned through Marcus, who stared at the message, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. He didn't respond, but he forwarded the email to Aisha, who saw it for what it was: Richard's desperation, a crack in his armor wide enough to exploit. She shared it with Lena, who added it to the dossier, another piece of evidence that Richard's leadership was crumbling under its own weight. As the day of the client's final review approached, Pinnacle buzzed with tension. Aisha, Javier, and Priya worked quietly to stabilize the project, using Marcus's files to guide their efforts. They didn't have his expertise, but they had his blueprint, and it was enough to make progress. Richard, oblivious to the rebellion brewing under his nose, prepared for the meeting with a rehearsed speech, banking on charm to save him. But Mr. Wallace had other plans. He'd scheduled a separate meeting with HR and the company's legal team to review Aisha's dossier, and the findings were damning. Richard's pattern of bias, his mismanagement, his lie about Marcus, it all pointed to a leader unfit for his role. Marcus, unaware of the full scope of what was unfolding, felt the weight of the moment. He sat in the community center, surrounded by the hum of collaboration, and checked his phone. A new message from Aisha. "It's happening. Tomorrow's the day. Stay ready." His pulse quickened. He didn't know what was, but he could feel the ground shifting, the scales tipping. Richard's world was unraveling, and Marcus's truth was about to step into the light. The reckoning was here, and it was only a matter of time before the full force of karma crashed down. The morning sun rose over Eastside with a clarity that felt almost prophetic, its light cutting through the haze to bathe the neighborhood in a golden glow. Marcus Jackson stood at his apartment window, coffee mug in hand, watching the city stir to life. The past weeks had been a whirlwind. His work with Jamal's co-op had blossomed, the app now a beacon of hope for freelancers across the city, its success celebrated in community centers and online forums. Yet, the shadow of Pinnacle Solutions loomed large, its unresolved injustice a weight Marcus carried even as he built a new future. Aisha's cryptic messages had kept him on edge, her latest one burning in his mind. It's happening. Tomorrow's the day. Today was that day, and though Marcus didn't know what was coming, he felt the air crackle with possibility, as if the universe itself was aligning to right a wrong. At Pinnacle, the corporate tower stood as a monument to ambition, but inside, chaos reigned. The client meeting with Ms. Harper's financial firm was set for noon, a make-or-break moment for the faltering server migration project. Richard Caldwell paced his office, his tie askew, his usual swagger replaced by a nervous energy that bordered on panic. He'd spent the night crafting a presentation, leaning heavily on Marcus's old work, passing it off as his own with a brazenness that masked his desperation. Ethan, his protégé, was a shadow at his side, offering little beyond nervous nods. The IT team, led quietly by Aisha, Javier, and Priya, had stabilized the project as best they could, using Marcus's meticulous files to patch the holes Richard's incompetence had left. But the team's loyalty was no longer to Richard, it was to the truth, and that truth was about to erupt. Aisha's dossier, now a thick file of evidence, had reached the highest levels of Pinnacle's leadership. Mr. Wallace, the senior manager, had spent the previous evening with HR and the legal team, poring over the documents. The pattern was undeniable: Richard's bias, his targeted firings, his lies about Marcus's involvement. It wasn't just mismanagement, it was a betrayal of the company's values, a stain that threatened Pinnacle's reputation. Mr. Wallace had made a decision, one that would ripple through the glass tower and beyond. As the client meeting approached, he called Aisha and Lena into his office, his expression grim but resolute. He needed one final piece to seal Richard's fate, and Aisha knew exactly what it was: Marcus. Miles away, Marcus was at the community center, debugging code for the co-op's app when his phone buzzed. It was Aisha, her voice steady but urgent. She told him about the dossier, the client meeting, and Richard's lie unraveling under scrutiny. Mr. Wallace wanted Marcus to join a call, to present his work directly to the client and expose the truth. It was a chance to reclaim his place, to show the world what he was capable of. Marcus's heart pounded, a mix of fear and fury coursing through him. He thought of his mother's sacrifices, Kayla's dreams, the nights he'd spent proving his worth only to be discarded. This was his moment, not just for revenge, but for redemption. The client meeting began with a tense silence, Ms. Harper's eyes scanning the room like a judge awaiting a verdict. Richard launched into his presentation, his voice smooth but strained, claiming credit for solutions Marcus had built. Aisha sat in the back, her laptop open, ready to act. Halfway through, Mr. Wallace interrupted, his tone calm but cutting. He introduced a special consultant, joining via video call, and Marcus's face appeared on the screen. The room froze. Richard's jaw tightened, his eyes darting to the exit as if he could escape what was coming. Marcus spoke with a clarity that silenced the room, walking through the project's technical details, his solutions, his innovations, all the work Richard had tried to erase. Ms. Harper listened, her expression shifting from skepticism to respect, then to anger as she realized the deception. Aisha took the opportunity to share her dossier, projecting emails and records that laid bare Richard's bias and mismanagement. The evidence was overwhelming. Marcus's firing wasn't about restructuring, it was personal, rooted in prejudice that had no place in a company claiming to value merit. Mr. Wallace stepped in, announcing Richard's immediate suspension pending a full investigation. The client, impressed by Marcus's expertise and appalled by Richard's actions, agreed to continue the contract, but only if Marcus was brought back to lead it. The room erupted in murmurs, the IT team exchanging glances of quiet triumph. Richard, stripped of his authority, left the meeting in silence, his career in ruins. Marcus ended the call, his hands trembling with the weight of what he'd done. He'd reclaimed his truth, not just for himself but for everyone who'd been pushed out by men like Richard. Aisha texted him a single word: justice. Back at Pinnacle, the team rallied around the project, their morale lifted by the promise of change. Mr. Wallace offered Marcus a full-time role with a promotion and an apology, but Marcus declined. His future was with the co-op, with the app that was changing lives in Eastside and beyond. He didn't need Pinnacle's glass tower, he'd built his own. That evening, Marcus sat with Evelyn and Kayla, sharing the story over dinner. Evelyn's eyes shone with pride, her hands steady as she squeezed his. Kayla, beaming, declared him her hero. The apartment felt lighter, the weight of the past lifted by the justice Marcus had helped deliver. Outside, Eastside pulsed with life, its resilience a mirror of his own. Richard's fall was complete, his reputation shattered, his lies exposed. But for Marcus, the victory wasn't in Richard's ruin. It was in the life he'd built, the family he'd protected, and the truth he'd reclaimed. Karma had struck, not with vengeance, but with the quiet power of justice, and Marcus Jackson stood taller for it.